Hello, beautiful community. Tomorrow we may do, health allowing, a longer chat about the diminishing power of Putin in Russia. But today we're going to do a fairly rapid-fire Q&A about Trump's victory, and I've got 5 questions from 5 people that have come in kind of repeatedly. So let's try to give them a go. Yella is saying, what will always puzzle me is why some gay people vote for Trump or equivalent homophobic parties in the European Union. So the post-60s rights revolution lifted up into inclusion a lot of groups. Some people from these groups are inside Trump's umbrella. And there is nothing strange about that. I mean, there is nothing strange about being black and gay and being outraged by the derision you perceive elites to be showing towards half of the population, both at the level of cultural regard and at the level of economic deprioritization. There's nothing inconsistent about being gay and black and finding hyper-identity politics and outrage, right? So there's plenty of reasons for virtually any kind of minority to be inside the Trump coalition. The question follows, are you going to practically benefit from Trump? And the answer is, if you are genuinely disadvantaged, Trump's likely to be worse for you than the Democrats. But that's a separate conversation about effective political decision making and so on. Michael is saying, sometimes when I look at the phenomena that is Trump and the collapse of the Republican Party here in America, I see some parallels to mass hysteria, word that, Michael, you're uncomfortable with. Sorry about the name. But I wonder if it can occur on a scale this large. The answer to that question is absolutely yes. I mean, one of the things we've talked about not having happened in Russia is mass mobilization, right? Mass political mobilization of the population. But we've talked about it being a hypothetical risk. So yeah, you can absolutely fascicize a population. History shows us that. However, when you look at the United States today, you see elements of what we would call, you see, I want to be careful about this term because talking about it would need to say a few things about Freud and a few things about the use of that term in medical establishment. I don't want to go there today, even though I believe there are some interesting things to be said about hysteria, and there is such a thing, actually. And the paradigm of it is when you relate to parts of your body or to certain actions of yours as though they are your genitalia, whereas they're not. So, for instance, a minor expression of hysteria is actually Trump's pout. So when this guy pouts, it's sexual. And it's absolutely disgusting and inappropriate, right? If you actually properly grasp what it is psychologically. Now, at the same time, there's lots of people, even me, who like to make fun of it, but got to call it what it is. But I don't want to mix that in to your question because we would need to spend a lot of time defining it. And I think that let's just talk about crowds going toxic, really toxic. There are some micro demographics in the United States that have gone into collective toxicity. A segment of the Trump vote, but absolutely not the majority of it, and a segment of the progressive camp with hyper-identity politics. But I don't think it follows from this that the Trump vote cumulatively represents some kind of crowd toxicity. I think the majority of the Trump vote is a combination of several things. Let's name a couple and not make the list too complete. But one is just a choice between values. That you don't take Trump to be too much worse on democracy than the other side, and in some ways you take him to be better. So in some ways there's a pro-democracy vote there in the Trump vote. There's an element of screw you to a system that's not working for half of America. And there's an element of wanting to liberate oneself into great economic regard, greater cultural respect, and so on. So you can explain in these sorts of benign ways much of what a Trump voter feels. You'd need to talk about the degree of misinformation there, but I'd start talking about the misinformation by talking about the breakdown of trust and breakdown of political agency first. So I think the answer is yes, but it certainly couldn't apply to the majority of Trump voters. Luke. Yuval Noah Harari in 2015 said, when the voters' preferences are a product that can be engineered, what does this mean for democracy? And Luke says, advertising is nothing new, but advertising targeted to an audience of one is. Several folks who are investigating this seem to believe that Musk's control of Twitter was instrumental in identifying specific voters to target with specific lies to most effectively demobilize a given likely Harris voter and likewise most effectively turn out a Trump voter. I mean, yes, you can talk about various ways in which Twitter X played a very irresponsible role in the election. But you don't want to start explaining the result of the election by naming a factor like that in your top 2 or 3. That's the first thing to say. Second thing to say more generally is that there is, of course, such a thing as false consciousness. And the paradigm for understanding false consciousness is to think that what somebody thinks is a product of the power that somebody else exercises over them, such that you remove the power and they're not any longer going to have the same opinion. And that's a normatively impeccable, that's an impeccable construct. The question is, how do you apply it in practice? It's difficult in practice to say what Ricky thinks is not a product of the power various political forces have over him, but what Susanna thinks is a product of what political forces, what power political forces exercise over her. So it's a very important principle, but the cases where it's obvious are limited. You could easily point to North Korea. But to talk about somebody's view being in that way in the power of a social media company is going to be a more fraught and delicate conversation. I mean, the answer here is we are screwed unless we make some kind of return over the next quarter century to public journalism. Journalism that is shared within a country, right? We don't have that at the moment. We have some institutions that are trying to relate to themselves as though they were out to speak to everybody, but they're mostly struggling with that task. If we don't recover quality public journalism that addresses an entire country, we're pretty screwed. So it's a really important enterprise. Bob is saying, in the wake of the recent election, considering not just the reduced turnout of voters for the Democratic Party candidate, but also for all candidates compared to 2020, is this an indication of any sort of depoliticization? So I haven't studied the turnout state by state in detail. but how does the fact that fewer people turned out, that needs to be broken down, but how does the fact that fewer people turned out in 2024 relative to 2020 relate to the question of depoliticization, and how does it resemble the phenomena elsewhere, the phenomenon of depoliticization elsewhere in the world? So I would say that in a country like Russia, the problem with depoliticization is that it's a way that people stay out of politics. The problem with depoliticization in the United States isn't that people are leaving politics for entertainment or for activities to do with self-expression, but that they are making politics entertainment and making politics to do with various forms of profile articulation and self-expression. So that's the biggest challenge. In the United States, most depoliticization actually takes the form of hyper-participatory relationships with politics that are still apolitical. Now, that's a completely inadequate answer to your really important question, but that's the 2 cents that I'd start with throwing in there. Brian, what are the components of thought or character which help to anchor and reinforce healthy democratic systems? That's your first question. Well, today it would just be having a sense of responsibility, thinking in terms of the public good, being reverential about institutions, and having a capacity for depolarizing communication. You could continue that list. Your second question, I've been surprised at how many people who voted for Trump seem to have done so with broken hearts, as if they're saying, how could we have been brought to this? I was not expecting this, and I'm still meditating on it. A large proportion, and possibly most, of the Trump vote, of the more committed Trump vote, is a vote for Trump in disgust. Trump is not seen, right, in a completely benevolent light by his supporters. Most people are voting for Trump while being not just somewhat repulsed by him, but somewhat repulsed by themselves for doing it. And this is very important, because it means that we're really living in an age, and that's a calamity, in which political representatives are less ethically solid than the average person down the street. Now, what you want are political representatives who are better ethically put together than a random person on the street. At the moment, we regularly are getting leaders elevated to prominence in Western countries who are ethically worse than literally a random person. I could just scream at someone out of the window here in East London, and they're going to have much more integrity than Boris Johnson. I'm going to be highly confident of that. So this is a real problem, a real crisis. So many Trump voters are much better ethically put together than Trump himself. And of course, it's worth saying that people who are struggling, people who are disadvantaged, tendentiously don't behave well. There's a kind of politically correct bullshit assumption that there's a purity to disadvantage. And that's not true. And in fact, somebody like George Bernard Shaw hated poverty in part through hating poor people. And so it's we certainly don't want to go there, but we need to be realistic and acknowledge that people who find themselves struggling begin to behave in a more mixed motive, in a more unlovely motive way. That's just inevitably human. Enough for today. Lots of love.